Hello, welcome to a Friday night movie. We are going to go back to the 1980s, 1987 to be precise, to review Maid to Order, starring Ali Sheedy as Jessie Montgomery. This story's tagline is, "Worst help is hard to find as a rich girl becomes a maid." However, the perfect tagline for this movie is a line spoken by the fairy godmother character, which is, "Some maids deserve to be princesses, and some princesses deserve to be maids." Something that's often missed in the Cinderella stories and the retellings is that way too many of these stories are based on Charles, sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this right. I know I'm not going to pronounce it right. Charles Porres, French translation and reinterpretation of the story. He tells it as a moral story, so there's actually a lesson in there. It's not just about being a passive victim of circumstances or waiting for somebody to come and rescue you, but rather it's about having the right heart attitude towards the people around you and your circumstances. And that was his message. So I like seeing the play on that in this moral story. Jessie is so spoiled, and she's the kind of person that craves attention all the time, and she's never satisfied with attention or the money she spends or anything like that. And she has to learn to listen and pay attention to other people and what they need, and to literally to just serve people out of the kindness of her own heart. That's the basic moral story of this. Now, being from the 1980s, it's really fun to watch. I'm the kind of person, other than fairy tale stories, I enjoy almost anything related to the 80s. I think it's fun. The music, the movies, the styles. And so I'm probably a little biased on whether or not the movie holds up. And I'll say it kind of depends on how you're viewing this movie. As a Cinderella story, it takes a lot of really cool images and twists them around to fit the fact that this is a play on those things that we're familiar with. The beats to the Cinderella story is being flipped on their heads. It's really topsy-turvy, and it's really awesome like that. And so, for example, the Cinderella stories, typically you see her as a maid throughout the story, and the transformation into the ball gown, and her first encounter with her fairy godmother is she goes from, the fairy godmother transforms her, so she goes from dressed in rags to this frilly outfit and looking fantastic and just like, every little girl's dream of, oh, she's so pretty, Of course, as interpreted by the directors and costume designers of that particular film, or artists if you're looking at a book. And so in this movie, Jess is in a party dress when she meets her fairy godmother, and then after she fights with the fairy godmother because she doesn't believe in fairy godmother, she walks away, and we see the slow, just the realistic, there's no magic to this aspect of the transformation, but just the harsh reality of her party dress being ruined as she's sleeping on the streets and has nowhere to go. I haven't really gotten into the plot, as I was talking more about the devices and the playing with the story, but the actual plot is Jess has gotten herself in so much trouble and has been such a burden on her single father that one night, when she goes to jail and he gets the call, he looks at his window and he says that he never thought he would say something like this, but he wished he never had a daughter. And you see the twinkling stars, and then, the fairy godmother shows up in the jail, and on one hand, that part of the story on one, it's like, I understand you have to do something to get the ball rolling, to set up how does this rich girl becomes a maid with no identity, nobody knowing who she is or anything, to, you know, just making all those changes. You have to do something, but the performance, even the father, like, you can kind of sense the heartbreak, but it still really bothers me, the concept of the father making such a wish. And getting back to the similarities of this story to your typical Cinderella story, her mother is gone. She doesn't have a stepmother or stepsisters. She's completely spoiled, so that's the opposite part. Her dad is there, and yet typically in the Cinderella stories, either her father passes after remarrying, leaving her to the mercy of her stepmother, or for some reason he's absent, such as going on a trip for work or something. Or he's there, but he's just so whipped that he lets his wife have her way on everything. And in the written forms, the father learns to stand up, or at least to feel remorse and grief at all of the awful things he's allowed to happen. And so in this story, you don't really get the proper closure with that character that I would like, as long as you're playing around with the Cinderella story and the father making that wish. I would have preferred a slightly modified ending. Now, I could go through and give some spoilers on things, but I don't like doing that, because if you do choose to watch that movie, I don't want to take away, like, all the juicy parts. So I try to do as detailed a critique as I can without taking away all the meat and all the fun. So back to the images of Cinderella and comparing. I really like the dress and that transformation. The fairy godmother appearing is very humorous. I love Stella. That's the name of the fairy godmother in this. I like her costumes. I like all of her lines, just her attitude. Honestly, if I made my top 10 list of favorite fairy godmother, fairy godpersons in Cinderella movies, she would be on that list. I'm not totally sure where on that list, but be at least midway. So, really enjoyable performance. The cast of this movie are good. I don't really recognize the guy who plays Prince. Like, I should probably know him, but I'm not familiar with the actor. So we have Ali Sheedy. Tom Skerritt plays the part of the father. We have Beverly D'Angelo as Stella, the fairy godmother. We have Dick, Shawn, and Valerie Perrine as the Starkys, and Michael Ontkean as the chauffeur, which is the equivalent of her Prince Charming. Another thing, so again with the setup, one of the first things that happens is she tries to go home because she doesn't believe the fairy godmother that she doesn't have an identity, that she's no longer her father's daughter. She thinks it's just like a trick. So she goes to the house, but none of the servants know who she is. Her father doesn't know her. Her own dog chases her out of the house, and she loses her slipper. So again, this is great, like, reversal, because she loses the slipper early on in the movie, and even though the slipper isn't used for, like, identification, like in a typical Cinderella story, it does make a reappearance later. And this slipper is just this, like, really pretty open-toed high heel, but it has a jewel on it, and it looks really cool. And again, I really liked the imagery and details that went into this movie. The The acting was pretty good. It varied, and the comedy varies, because I don't typically like the awkward confrontations, awkward situations. To me, those are more painful than they are comedic, and just painful to watch. Even though the performance might be great, it's just I can't stand watching that kind of stuff, and so I don't enjoy that part of the humor. And yet, because of the plot, it's kind of necessary that certain scenes are going to happen. Like, in particular, that first confrontation with her father, and then she sees him again. She ends up getting a job at the Starky's house, and they're this wealthy power couple, I guess you could say, and Mr. Starky is a music producer, and Mrs. Starky is kind of his brain, which isn't saying much. And the performance is funny. The references, there's some really interesting humor. One of the things about the 80s is when the 80s were even mocking themselves, and even in retrospect, people after the 80s, they talk about the decadence. It was all about money, 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 and wealth, and part of that, I think, has to do with the Cold War, and America in particular being, oh, we're the opposite of communists, so we have so much, we have all this stuff, and going to the extreme of just being really wasteful and spoiled with it. And some 80s movies, especially those that came out later, do comment on that. And so there's some really interesting lines in this movie that I feel are they're subtle and some not so subtle commentary of even the style, the decadence, the attitudes, the positive and negatives of that time. And so in retrospect, I think it helps hold the movie up higher, and it does help it make it more rewatchable, and you can watch it from that perspective of just watching a movie from the 80s making fun of the 80s, and especially the styles. The Starkys represents every wild, insane style and just the weirdness of the 80s, which, again, back to the Cinderella side of things, if you watch the Roger and Hammerstein's versions of Cinderella, the stepsisters are always just wild neon colors and just crazy hair, and they just look ridiculous. And even in the opera that I reviewed, Cinderella, the stepsisters kind of have that crazy hair. The outfits aren't quite as crazy, but there's just always something about the stepsisters in about 90% of Cinderella films of one form or another, where the stepsisters just look kind of out there. And so the Starkys in this movie, they represent kind of the stepsisters. You don't have a stepmother character, but you have these employers who visually and intellectually and just their physical appearance, they're not necessarily attractive looking people. I mean, they could be, but they are made to look just what is wrong with you people? And they think they're so smart, and they think they're clever, and they represent so many crazy things about the time. And so again, I love that they're making social commentary on their own time period, and at the same time, they are taking visual cues and character arcs, or archetypes rather, from the traditional interpretations of Cinderella. So I think, in those ways, the movie holds up. I watched it, as you could tell, it's on VHS. I got this from a yard sale. I was excited to find this because I had seen this movie a few times on television, and I looked up to see, if I could find it on DVD, if I could recommend buying it. And it was released on DVD twice, but it was very limited, and then they stopped making it. So at this time, unless you buy excuse me, like maybe you can find it on eBay or somebody reselling it on Amazon or Craigslist or something like that. You're not likely to find this. And so I don't think, like, picture-wise, the images hold necessarily. Like, you know, it's not digital, it's not remastered, it's not gonna look amazing, crystal clear on the kind of televisions and things like that that we have today. The special effects are really not much in there. It's very limited, but I think that works in its favor, because even though it does have a fairy godmother and it does have these elements of wishes coming true and things, it also has a very down-to-earth storyline. And so you don't need a lot of special effects. And like I said, like, the transformation of the outfit is just, it's realistic. It's just like time and the character moving and trying to find something decent to wear. And so, yeah, it works. Instead of having to have that magical transformation for the dress, you have the realistic things wear out. And they don't, you know, the party dress doesn't last long when you spend the night in jail and then the next night on the street because you have nowhere to go. So, there's not a lot of special effects to talk about on here. So overall, okay, the character Jess, I wavered back and forth about whether she was a good interpretation or not and how I felt about this character. I watched the movie twice, maybe 2.5 times, at least twice, and it was kind of hard to decide because she is so unlikable in the first half of the movie. Well, okay, the first third at least. In the second third, I think they did do a good job of letting the character grow on you. And it's almost like she really takes her time to finally earn the right to be Jessie Montgomery again, to be her father's daughter again. And it kind of annoyed me that it took so long for her to get to that point, but she does. Another thing is, before her transformation, we are introduced to this guy that she likes, but he doesn't really want to party with her anymore. We're introduced to the servants at her house and her father. So we're introduced to this set of people that really have, other than her father, no consequences on the real story. And then we're introduced to the Starkys and the Starky servants and things like that. And that disappoints me. I think it would have been a little better if somehow she got a job working for her father as his servant and getting to know those characters and getting to know, like, is this rich party dude that, well, not so party dude, that she liked, to see, you know, what kind, is he a Prince Charming, is he like just a rich dude who's just as spoiled as she is, but he's not as wild as she is. We really don't know anything about him. He's there and then he's gone. And we have two or three female characters that were introduced for one scene just to show the embarrassment of her walking up to people that she thinks of her friends, and they're like, we don't know who you are. And I mean, I understand, like, why those scenes are there, but I felt like I would have preferred to spend more time getting to know those characters a little bit, for them to serve more than just 1 or 2 scenes in the story. And yet, the Starkys are fun. They do add so much texture. Their daughter, Bree, doesn't. That was kind of annoying because she has, like, 3 scenes. At the very end, she's hugging Jess, and she's acting like somehow she should be friends with these servants, but we've never seen that kind of relationship established with her. And so I felt like either something was added to that movie that shouldn't have been added because it has no foundation, but just to give the warm fuzzies at the end, or there was a subplot with her that got cut, and so that's like a residual of something that had been there. I'm not sure, and without like any special features or anything, I can't tell you. It would be really cool if there was like another plot line in there that was trimmed for the sake of time, and if like it still existed somewhere, that would be kind of cool. But Jess, ultimately, I did give her a 3 because after rewatching the movie and thinking about it, it's like, yeah, her transformation of attitude and heart and learning her lesson is slow, but it's not like it goes from one extreme whiplashing to another extreme. It's not like that at all. And she goes from one extreme, a little better, she pretends to be learning her lesson, to learning one step of the lesson, to truly, truly being selfless. And so there are these stages, and on one hand, they leapfrog on one another a little bit, but it works. And so, yeah, I give her a 3. Her Prince Charming is Nick MacGyver, like seriously, that MacGyver was the character's name. Like, okay. I didn't like him at first, but he really does show a kindness to him. As a romantic movie, like I said, does it hold up with things? If you're viewing it for a romantic movie, I don't think it really does, because I still think like there's something missing from their relationship developing. I would have liked that developed more. Like, why? I feel like they're just together because he was written to be the love interest. I mean, he does show himself to be a talented musician, to be like really passionate about trying to get into the music industry, a hard worker, although he's not a very good mechanic, even though he tries. And oh, I love this. There is a reference in this movie to Cinderella in, you know, I don't know for sure that it's purposeful, but I gotta think it has to be purposeful, because there's this scene like he's trying to work on the car when he's first introduced and it's not going well, and then later in the movie he goes to drive the Starky somewhere and the car starts making these noises, and that's like one of the very, very first scenes in Cinderella. And so I laughed. Like, I didn't catch that the first time I watched it. I caught the mechanic part, but I like missed the car backfiring and having the billow of smoke the first time. So I'm glad I rewatched it to catch it the second time, because like, oh yeah, Cinderella. And so it's cool. Like I said, I could see where they deliberately borrowed from a lot of material here. So as a Cinderella fan, I think it totally works. And it's funny, like, growing up as a kid, Cinderella was not my favorite fairy tale at all. But the more I do research and find, like, there's so much material for Cinderella, the more I really just, like, appreciate it, because it has, like, such a huge cultural impact. Not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And there's so many different versions, and there's, like, movies, books, and everything, and it's just so fascinating to me to see. And like, as I'm trying to dig around, like, what makes the story so special, I just get wrapped up in all of the mythology of this story, this, like, the pop culture reference, and how these Cinderella stories are referencing one another. I just love it. Now, oh, I do need to make this reference. It is rated PG. This was, I believe, before the rating PG-13 came out. So there is some foul language, and there's scenes where they're skinny dipping. So it may not really be appropriate for a PG audience. I think because of the smoking and the skinny dipping scenes. I mean, it doesn't really show anything except for butt cheeks in one shot, and some foul language. I think if it was rated today, it would be a PG-13. So just a warning on that. But, so like I said, I really like Stella. The dad character, I only give him a 2. I give him an average because even though he's a twist on the character, I don't think they did enough new things with him. He gets the ball rolling by making the wish. He's there at the end of the story. He comes in and he's in each act. He has at least one scene in each act. And his presence shows us a little bit of Jess's, like, where she is on her journey of accepting things or rejecting the reality she's in and everything. But as a character in of himself, I would have liked to have seen more of him grow too, of him learn something as well, because he did make that wish. So as the catalyst for this, I feel like there was something missing by him not getting a lesson himself in this, for them not developing more with him and just keeping him a plot device. The other characters, they go back and forth. Some are 3s, some are 2s. Again, with my rating, 0 is dislikable, 1 is nothing special, 2 is average, 3 above average, 4 really good, 5 excellent. I'm really picky. I haven't given a 5, I think, to anything yet, much less in this movie. And 4s, none of the characters quite rated that much, but the costumes I get 4. Because not just the crazy and wild things, but like, just, they are, like, how we see the fairy godmother Stella, how we see the servants, the different, stations in life and these people, and how they dress, mirroring, like, their social economic status in the story. And just, it is great 80s, making fun of the 80s, as well as the social economic commentary that you get slipped in here. The music, I wavered back and forth on this. I gave it a 4. I liked it. Partly there's the music in the opening credits. Yeah, it sounds more contemporary, well, for the time, but it does also have that air of a fairy tale, those notes that makes you feel like you're watching a fairy tale, and so it fits really good, as well as the music you hear sung in the movie, because the Starkys, they're in the music industry. Nick is into music. One of the other house servants, she's the cook, Audrey, she's a singer. And again, there's a cook in this. Well, I mean, yeah, she's a maid, so you see a cook, but in some versions of Cinderella, especially like Tattercoats, it's the cook that kind of watches over the Cinderella character. And in this, Audrey takes Jess under her wings. I mean, on one hand, she's annoyed, she's lazy, and yet she is an older woman, and she just had this motherly instinct, and so she is, like, more prone to give Jess a second chance and encourage her to make those changes and to grow up. And so I really like that. I mean, of course, you're going to have a cook in a household with servants like this and everything. It just makes sense, but it's also like, she's a mother character that happens. And the acting is 3. It's above average. All of it's good. Watching the Starkys can be, like, cringeworthy, but it's just because the characters are so cringeworthy, but that's what they're supposed to be, so that's good acting. It's not like, oh my goodness, this acting is horrible. No, it's like, oh my goodness, these actors are really selling these characters, and it's really, it's really good. I think I talked about everything. I do like the banter. There's some cutting wit and stuff like that. And as I said, there's just a little bit of commentary of the social economics. And that works really well for a Cinderella story. I think a lot of people miss this when it comes to Cinderella stories. And in this way, Made to Order is not like a total like throw out everything that we know about Cinderella and yet we're going to call it Cinderella. Because typically, in a lot of these stories, our maid that becomes a princess, she's actually usually of either her father's a merchant, so she's low or, upper class, or he is of nobility, and so she is of nobility herself, but she is treated by her family and put in a position of servitude by her family. And so she is of that noble birth, and she re-earns that in the Cinderella story. So just going from a spoiled rich girl to a maid and then earning back her father and her identity is not a completely reversal of the story. It really does actually borrow from that. The difference is in Jess's case, she's going to another household to be a servant, whereas in the typical Cinderella story, it's in her own family's household that she becomes a servant. And then the real reversal is just the attitude of the primary characters. In the fairy tales, especially the well-known one, Charles Perlet, his moral story was being a kind, giving person despite the circumstances. And in his story, she's forgiving and she is loving and caring towards her stepsisters despite how they treat her. Not because she's a doormat, but because she has strength of character to carry her through. In Jess's case, she has that reversed. She has her father and the servants, and she looks down her nose at the servants, and she's jealous because her father does all this charity work for other people, and even though he gives her so much, and she's desperate for attention for herself, and then she has to learn to put other people first. So in that respect, the character growth is a reverse, because in the Cinderella, it's the readers get the lesson. The other people in the story, the family, gets the lesson of treating people the right way for the right reasons, not because of what you can get from them. And feeling that shame for the way they behaved. And Jess, she has to feel that sense of shame. So I think I'm just repeating myself a little too much, probably. Definitely took more time with this review than I was going to, but I'm glad because YouTube has finally allowed me to upload videos longer than 15 minutes, so that's nice. I hope you've enjoyed this review. For a final rundown, after I add up everything from all the categories, divide it by the 15, because I have 15 categories, the total score is 2.93. So it's better than average. It's not quite 3, which would be above average. I haven't yet had a movie break up to the 4 mark, even though I have made it to the 3 mark. But it's a decent film. If you like things from the 80s, I say give it a try. If you like just comedies and awkward humor doesn't bother you, or you enjoy a sharp dialogue, give it a try. there's definitely a lot there to enjoy. The performances, definitely one of them, especially the fairy godmother. Ali Sheedy is a fantastic actress. Yeah. So next movie you will see me doing A Cinderella Story, If the Shoe Fits. I believe this one also has this music in it, so I guess it'll be kind of an interesting comparison. And then for New Year's, I will be binge watching, yeah, all of the Disney Cinderella stories. Another Cinderella story. A Cinderella Story, Once Upon a Song. This is gonna be a fun month.